on the future of work. This is going to be mostly focused on how blockchains will affect the future of work. Here, I'll give you guys a second to put your earphones in. Let me know. Good? Yeah, so this will not be an extremely technical talk, but if you do have technical questions about how blockchains work or to go into some of the deeper problems that we talk about here, I'm happy to chat after. You can find us at the consensus booth in the far corner. So let's just talk about work and what work looks like right now for most people. And for most people, this is what it looks like. You have a large corporation, and you have many employees who work for that corporation exclusively. They're sort of tied in this one-to-many relationship. And that's very boring, in my opinion. And there's a number of problems with that. And what's cool is that with the internet and the advent of the internet, people are starting to see more dynamic labor, as it's referred to, organizing around what needs to get done. The idea being that instead of having to hire someone in very long-term contracts, which is very reminiscent of the manufacturing age and the Industrial Revolution, for most knowledge work, we can actually work in much smaller durations on different projects. So this is what the gig economy has been all about. Most of you guys, some of you might have worked as freelancers, might have hired as freelancers to complete tasks, and have found it to be very beneficial. Freelancers prefer to work, a lot of freelancers prefer to work that way because they like the variety in their work, and that provides them meaning and value. And this is something people in the sort of organizational behavior study space of business understand very well, which is that humans like and prefer variety in their projects, and moving between projects or working for several teams simultaneously has strong benefits for them, because working on the same project for a very long time can be quite boring, as many of you might know. Firms also similarly benefit from short-term labor. You don't have to hire people for long-term contracts, so you don't have as much wasted money through people not being properly utilized or their time not being properly spent working, since you're only hiring people to do the work that you need them to do, and not paying people for their overtime or if they're just sitting idle waiting for new tasks. And so this is what this could potentially look like. This is what this gig economy promises, at least, where you have many of these companies, but if you can see, the individuals, instead of being tightly coupled to one company, are very much more free to move between companies. You have this sort of mesh network of individuals who might be able to share lessons from one company to another, and similarly companies who can hire a plethora of people simultaneously, possibly more people than they would if they had to pay people only on a full-time basis. So freelancing 1.0 is what we refer to the first wave of these gig economy companies. Like I said, most of you have probably either worked for some of these or used them, and they're quite popular and have achieved a fair amount of success. I'll go into a little bit of the results of this freelancing 1.0 experiment, but it shows what we believe is sort of the first step in the movement towards the gig economy or dynamic labor forces, to help people be a little bit more efficient and help labor markets be a little bit more efficient at allocating capital and resources. So like I said, there's a number of problems with these existing sites, although they solved problems significantly better than you would have done before the internet and before these sites existed. There are still a number of problems. The first one, in our view, the most important one, is high fees. So most of these companies charge sometimes between 10 and 20%. Some companies like Topcoder might be able to charge up to 90% of fees, which means that only 10% or 80% of the money you're spending actually goes towards paying freelancers. And so what that means is that the quality of the talent you're going to be getting from these talent pools is going to be lower, for every dollar you spend, than if most of the money or if all of the money was potentially going to pay the freelancers. As well, you have very poor reputation tracking. The example I like to bring up is, if I'm an Uber driver and I start screwing people over, with my driving practices, and I am also a graphic designer on Fiverr, let's say, if I've become untrustworthy or if I've started colluding or stealing work or something like that on one platform, that wouldn't be reflected on any other platform. And so my identity is like very coupled to the platform, and it's not sort of a universal identity, which makes signaling cross-platform much more difficult. Lack of interoperability, this is again pretty important. When you go back, you see that this market is very, very fragmented. You don't have one platform where most jobs are posted. Most people have to pick one of these platforms and post their jobs there, which sucks because you're limiting yourself to only the user base on that platform, and it's just too much work to have to be going from one to the next. And so it would be great for there to be some sort of interoperability among these sites. Need for a bank account, this one's pretty easy, but for us sort of in Western or more developed countries, this is a much easier task to accomplish. For people in developing nations, this is much more difficult. People who don't have access to proper identity services, for whom financial services are either very, very expensive to employ or simply not available. And so next you have bad incentives. Most employment, as we see in like that very first graphic, when you have many people working for the firm, those people are properly incentivized because they're often paid in fiat currencies in the local currency where they're working, but they're also paid either in revenue sharing or in equity or in some mechanism which aligns the incentives of the company, which is usually to increase their profits, with the employee who can somehow benefit from that increase in profits or their success. And so that doesn't actually exist with most freelancing. Most freelancing, freelancers are only paid in fiat currencies. Very unlikely or unusual for freelancers to have access to any equity or anything like that. And finally, social problems. These are mostly problems that result from the other issues that I highlighted. But these basically revolve around the idea that people assume that outsourcing work is low quality or low price, and they don't. And so this sort of limits the ability for dynamic labor to feasibly replace the work that people are doing in a full-time, space, because only low-tier or low-quality projects will ever be outsourced completely. And so we don't actually believe that this is true. We don't believe that this is necessary for labor markets that are shorter term to necessarily be lower quality, and that if you can craft your platform properly, you can have better signaling so that you can have sort of a lower end of the market where people are charging much lower amounts, but maybe their reputation isn't as high because the quality of their work simply isn't as good. But you can also have a high tier of reputation where people are producing really high quality work. And if some of you may have hired freelancers before or worked as freelancers, it's pretty well known in the industry that the highest tier, most highest quality freelancers, to find them, you often have to use word of mouth. And so you won't find high-quality freelancers on the sites I mentioned. You have to find them through referrals, through friends or peers and things like that. And so obviously that doesn't scale very well and makes it much more difficult to find people who can accomplish the tasks that you need. So this is sort of a disclaimer. A lot of people in a lot of presentations I've heard at least already will say blockchains will solve all problems. That's not true, unfortunately. Blockchains will solve some problems very well, some problems they will not solve well at all. And so instead of just attacking on blockchain to every problem space and assuming it'll solve something or to seem innovative, it's important to sort of use blockchains for very distinct explicit purposes that are useful, and I can talk about that in the context of freelancing, and if you ever have any questions about that, I'm happy to chat after as well. But basically, the two things that we recognize that blockchains are very useful for in the context of freelancing is for eliminating some of the trust necessary, in managing and upholding transactions and business logic without relying on middlemen, and the low barriers to entry for international payments compared to legacy financial institutions. And this is especially true because the entire point of freelancing is that you're paying people who aren't in your location, who are very typically located in outside jurisdictions. And so because of that fact, you want to have access to as many people as possible, and accessing people who don't have bank accounts is very difficult on existing systems. So there's a number of ways that blockchains can have an extremely positive impact on freelance economies. First one is cheaper transactions. Most of you have already probably heard about this, but you can see something like a 98% transaction cost reduction by using blockchains as opposed to existing financial institutions and payment rails. And so what this means is that not only can consumers be there's simply like lower costs to the transactions that they're doing. This means that the platforms, instead of charging 10 to 20%, which is maybe fair because the costs for them are so high to uphold these payment rails, instead they can charge significantly lower percentages of the fees, maybe 1%, maybe 5%, because the value they're creating simply isn't as much because the blockchains are managing the actual transactions and payments among international entities. So like I said, international payments are the next one. This is, very, very impactful. Most people don't realize, but there's this like massive cohort, millions of people in just underdeveloped countries who don't have proper banks and who would be probably happy and willing to perform tasks and earn, money and sort of generate economies, but they don't have access to these jobs or to these tasks because they are just in countries that are underserviced. And so the cool thing about blockchain is the low barriers to entry make it possible to actually work with those individuals. And this is especially more true for lower skilled tasks. And so the labor markets can be a little bit more efficient in terms of allocating those tasks to people who would be willing to perform them for the cheapest price at the quality that's required. Next, improved interoperability. Like I said before, when I post a task, it doesn't ever get cross-posted across several sites. This sucks, and largely sucks for users. But the cool thing is that when you use a blockchain, you can have a shared database of bounties or of tasks which are not administered by any one company or provider, but are actually administered by a group or a consortium of companies coming together to the benefit of their users. And so we'll talk a little bit about the standardization process around that later, but this has like very massive potential for changing the way companies and competitors in the technology ecosystem work, because in existing systems, you look at social networks, for example, like Facebook and Twitter, their entire businesses are built on being these like walled gardens of information where your profile data can't be shared very easily between Facebook and Twitter, and they do that on purpose because they don't want you to switch between these platforms. But the cool thing about blockchains is that this is actually encouraged, and that people are coming together and companies are coming together and forming these consortia and forming these standards to fix that problem. And so this is something we'll see a lot in the freelancing space to make those markets more efficient, but will likely be experienced across blockchain application verticals. Next, immutable reputation tracking. This one also makes a lot of sense. On blockchains, you have one identity. It's your address, your public key. And so for that reason, when I use one platform and then switch to a new one, the reputation I've gained or earned or accumulated, whether it's positive or negative, is tied to that address. And so as long as those platforms can have shared manners in which they can access that reputation data, or if it's just publicly auditable on chain, then individuals can have sort of a one reputation which better encapsulates their reputation. So for example, if I order rides on Uber, but I also stay at people's homes in Airbnb, if I have a positive reputation on one website, that can very easily reflect on the other and vice versa. And so you have just like better signaling and more honest signaling about what your reputation is, instead of it being very much tied to only one platform, which makes it very difficult to accumulate reputation as like a new member of those communities. And finally, aligned incentives. This one is very interesting, and this is something that we're still very much exploring. As many of you, if you've heard a lot about the blockchain space, you've probably heard a lot about the number of ICOs or token sales, which many companies have done. Some of them very fruitfully, some of them not so much. But the cool thing is that because the efficiency with which you can transact with tokens, and you can have tokens that represent, they may be securities, which represent a share of equity or a share of revenue. They might be utility tokens, which represent the ability to perform some action in your platform. But if you have the company, the firm, has a large balance of these tokens, they can actually pay freelancers in these tokens, or they can pay them in fiat currencies or stable coins on blockchains along with along with these tokens. And so this has this incentive aligning possibility where, similarly to at the very beginning, how you had firms which were paying many people with both equity and fiat currencies, you can now have the same thing in freelance markets, which we believe is very important to align the incentives of these actors, which is what we believe is a big problem right now with freelancer markets. And the key is that when you have these aligned incentives, people are incentivized not only to perform the minimum required amount of work or quality of work for what they expect they would need to for their work to be submitted and accepted, but they actually are now incentivized to perform their best work because they know that the tokens that they're going to be getting might be actually more valuable or more useful if the quality of their work increases. And so it's that like incentive alignment idea which is so critical to blockchains and is very common. You'll hear that a lot. And it also applies very, very well to the freelancer marketplace. So we've taken it a little bit further than that. By focusing on bounties, basically. Bounties they've existed for thousands of years. Very often they were administered by nation states and governments, sometimes in a very evil way, to capture criminals and things like that. And they were also very expensive to issue. To issue a bounty, you would post a wanted poster maybe in a certain place, or you would have to have a large amount of influence to be able to do that. But what we're trying to do is make it possible for bounties to be created for any task, or for any service, or for any good. And so I'll explore a little bit how bounties are different than most of the transactions that we do on our day-to-day lives. So, free market, the first point is basically that free markets can respond better to prices. And what that means is that when people have a desire for a good or a desire for a service, they can actually determine the price that they would like to pay, as opposed to being required to pay the price that people who are providing those goods or services have chosen, or that they predict that we would be willing to pay. And so because they have to make this prediction, and because often prices are fixed over time and aren't able to move very rapidly, you don't have efficiency in the price mechanism of labor in the context of freelancing, but in general in the context of a lot of the markets that we use. When I go to the grocery store, those prices are fixed. For most of the services that we might get, a haircut or a manicure, they don't correspond to the demand for those services at any given moment, and so those prices can't adjust properly. But bounties do something that's very interesting. Bounties flip the supply and demand of markets. So most markets, most economics 101, you'll learn you have a supply side and a demand side. The supply side usually is the people who supply the good or the service or the labor, and the demand side is people with money who will purchase that good or service or labor from the individual. And so usually the steps are that the supply side is a market maker, and they will publicly state or advertise that they have a good or service that they like to perform. And like I said, this is how most of the transactions we do on our day-to-day lives are performed. And then you have the taker side, which is people with money who can opt in and pay and get those goods or services. But bounties flip that. And so with bounties, what you have is that the supply side, the market maker, are the people with money. The people with money are now the people who are initiating the market transactions. And the people who are providing a good or providing a service are the people who are taking. And so, like I said, this has some implications on making more efficient price movements, but it also has implications on the quality or the value of the goods and services you're receiving. Because when you're putting out a bounty for something which is a little bit more bespoke, a little bit more customized for you or for your company, and like I said, this is more relevant for the freelancer market, where not all tasks are equal, and very often the difficulty or the amount of work that would go into a task is very much dependent on the company that it's being done for. If it's a code contribution, it depends on the stack that's being used and how much legacy code do you have to work with versus how much can you do, on your own. And so when you have this, we're basically making these markets a little bit more efficient by having better price mechanisms, but also by making the good or service that you're getting possible. It's possible for it to be a little bit more customizable for the needs of the user. Next, you also have less time spent sourcing talent. So right now, when a company puts out an advertisement saying they have a good or a service, they pull customers in, whereas with this method, you can now have people with money pulling in people who have goods or services. And so people who have money can spend less of their time actually trying to get those goods and services, but they can simply just put up a bounty and say, I need someone to make me a logo, for example, and wait for submissions to come in or wait for people to submit their intention. And so instead of you having to go, for example, in the freelancer world, very often if you're trying to hire a freelancer, you might have to find maybe a short list of 5 freelancers who you believe might be able to perform the task you want. Then you have to go through this lengthy negotiation process where you have to decide on what a fair price might be for this. You have to actually determine if they're capable of performing this task, and that isn't even always clear in and of itself. But when you have this bounty and you have this task pre-described and you have your price pre-named, people will self-select to only perform the tasks that they're capable of doing and that they're willing to do for the price. And so you have this time saving where people aren't having to negotiate price. People aren't having to thoroughly explain re-explain what they want. They can just have it be out there publicly viewed, and anybody who can perform those tasks can take them on. However, this leads to a new problem, which is that people don't know what they want. And this is a much harder problem in like the rest of the world, because a lot of times people don't understand the implications of what they're asking for. A lot of times people actually just don't know what they want, but they know what a possible positive outcome might be, and so some work needs to be done to actually figure out what an implementation might look like to solve that problem. And this is sort of the core problem that we're trying to tackle right now, which is when you don't have time spent negotiating prices, how can we make it as efficient as possible to describe what it is you're trying to build or what you want someone to perform for you, even when you don't fully know the implications of performing or implementing that thing. So, results. We've been running live on Ethereum for the last 8 months, and we've had some significant traction. And what's interesting is that we're seeing, so the Bounties Network, we work with a company called Gitcoin because we're trying to push this open standard, and being this open protocol for bounties on Ethereum, we work with many competitors and collaborators and other platforms, basically, which are focused on bounties for particular verticals. And so the first vertical that we've been targeting is Gitcoin, and Gitcoin is bounties on open source code contributions. And so Gitcoin has seen significant traction because the open source world sometimes can have funding, but it's very difficult to get people to maintain those repositories, even though they're quite popular. But what we're noticing is that the number of freelance contributions or open source contributions, that people are making goes up substantially after they start using Gitcoin because they're now being incentivized for it. And those repos are able to get money because some repositories are starting to advertise on their READMEs. There's different methods of contributions that people are using. And so this is sort of a more efficient allocation of capital instead of having to allocate capital to large firms who will maintain open source repositories. You can just have 1 or 2 sort of administrators, developers who are officially maintainers of open source repositories, and they can be putting bounties on open issues that users open. And so you can have a much more rapid development of your protocol or your framework or whatever that open source component is. And this is working quite successfully. And so, we're seeing pretty substantial growth, not only in the bounties people are posting for code, but also in the bounties people are fulfilling. And they're quite happy getting paid in cryptocurrencies because, cryptocurrencies provide significantly faster processing time. They obviously we take significantly lower fees than you might have to if you were using an existing site. But also there's like an interesting viewpoint where you have this access to a talent base which is capable of performing cryptocurrency. If you guys have ever tried to use cryptocurrency wallets these days, sometimes they're very difficult. But if you're building a crypto project or in general or looking for a particular type of users, those types of users are capable of earning crypto right now and are interested in it. And so you have an interesting dynamic where the market, which is performing tasks, are the people who you are most trying to target to perform your task, basically, the smartest of people. And so this is a nice graphic that shows basically the growth historically of the Gitcoin network and how you see people moving to repositories, and they move between repositories, and they're very often shared. And so you end up with this mesh network. And this is very important because mesh networks, you have localized information sharing among these small companies, as you'll see, but you also, because you have individuals who are shared, you can now have lessons shared among companies in a much more efficient manner, in a much more collaborative manner. Because a lot of these firms are not direct competitors, but in fact, people are working on adjacent platforms, you can have this significant opportunity where, your core IP can still say internally to your company, but you can have, lessons about technology architecture or, debugging and things like that, or just in general best practices being passed between teams. And so this generally is beneficial for all of these teams and for the freelancers themselves who are getting much more capable. And what's interesting is that we're actually also seeing that this is becoming a very feasible way for freelancers to onboard themselves into full-time roles. And so we're noticing that the future of work isn't just distributed, fully like we might have described, where people are only doing dynamic labor, but it's somewhere in the middle, where maybe individuals have a full-time job and they do bounties or freelance work. Or sometimes a firm might have a set of freelance employees and a set of full-time employees who work together on a consistent manner, and that the people who start as freelancers might be onboarded full-time as full-time employees after they've proven themselves and their merit and their ability to work with the team and their interests. And so this provides, for human resources perspective, a significantly better onboarding experience than you having to constantly interview somebody to give them code challenges and things like that. Code challenges which are often not at all relevant to the problems that are being solved within the company. But if you're giving people code challenges which are relevant issues which they would need to be working on, and you're able to pay them for it in an efficient manner, then you basically have a much better test of future employees, which is what we're actually noticing happening in practice. So, like I mentioned, the Bounties Network is this open protocol for bounties on Ethereum. And when we set out to build the Bounties Network, we did it with the idea that bounties in themselves have these sort of core steps. Bounties are issued, so you would advertise what it is, the task or the good that you need and how much you would pay. Bounties are fulfilled, so people who are willing to provide that good or service for the price stated will make a submission to basically give that good or service. And submissions are accepted. And you need that acceptance step because most submissions are very qualitative in nature, especially service-based ones, where the deliverable itself needs to be evaluated. And so after that submission, or after that acceptance step, people can actually get the money that they're being paid in cryptocurrencies, often much faster than they would without the same time delays that you get with existing freelancing, where more than a third of freelancers get paid late, and that's because sometimes it's the payment rails, sometimes it's banking issues, sometimes it's just that they don't have the money yet. But with bounties, that's just not as possible. And so, because we have this open protocol, we are sort of helping build these new sub-verticals for new sites. So, like I said, Gitcoin is bounties for open source code. But we're currently trying to build many of these types of platforms: bounties for graphic design, bounties for translations, social impact bounties, which is sort of like social impact charitable contributions being made directly to causes where money can then go to stakeholders on the ground who are either cleaning up oceans, to bounties for communities to come together and save their forests from being deforested and things like that. And so these are verticals that we're actively targeting and actually encouraging you developers, anybody in the room, to build on. And so we have a number of open source components that are easy to build on, that you basically build your own product using the tech that we've built and start earning fees and start earning money. And so there's a huge opportunity here for products to spin up. And so again, if you guys are interested in that, I'm happy to chat after. And finally, I'll just highlight the notion of the standard. And this is very, very important, and this is arguably the most important element of making a lot of what I've described come to fruition. That entire idea of interoperability, of reputation, and of security of blockchains isn't possible when you don't have standards. Standards are good because they encourage the reuse of code that's been tested, had eyes on it, public bug bounties, private audits, and then so it's most secure. And this is especially important in the blockchain ecosystem. Blockchains, Ethereum had a number of security bugs found in smart contracts, which have resulted in funds either being locked or stolen. And so having reusable code is very important, and having standards is equally important. But also, in order for tasks to be shared among platforms, they need to be following the same standards so that they can obviously interface with them very easily. And so for that reason, we started working on this standard a year ago. It's, after we've actually proven out what users want, it's gone through substantial iteration, but we've now sort of pushed it as a formal standard for Ethereum. Ethereum, if you guys are familiar, is like Bitcoin, but a little bit different, and that's the blockchain that we employ at the Bounties Network and everything runs on. And so there are standards which you can propose for Ethereum, which allow you to encourage collaboration among teams and to come together on like one standard interface that everyone will agree to. And so this is what is currently underway for standard bounties. And so you can have standard bounty interfaces on Ethereum to be shared among these platforms. So that's it for the future of work. I mentioned a lot of topics from a very cursory level, from a very high level, and I wanted to keep this as beginner as possible. But if you have any questions about how any of this stuff works in the back end or questions about Ethereum, I'm happy to answer after or publicly right now through the microphone. So if you have any questions, ask her.